Welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by the Institute of Navigation titled National Strategy for Ocean Mapping, Exploring and Characterizing the United States Exclusive Economic Zone and the Global Seabed 2030 Initiative. Before we begin, we want to let you know that registration for ION-GNSS Plus is currently open. ION-GNSS 2022 will be taking place in September in Denver, Colorado. You can view the entire technical program and register at ion.org/GNSS. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Michael Dennis, geodesist and SBCS 2022 project manager with NOAA, NOS, and the National Geodetic Survey. We now welcome Dr. Dennis.
Thank you, Rick. It's very much my pleasure to participate in today's webinar. As you said, I'm a geodesist, but I'm also a surveyor and a civil engineer. And at first blush, it might seem odd having a geodesist moderate a webinar on ocean mapping. Actually, the presenters and I share an overall integrated mission and a common legacy. We all work in NOAA's National Ocean Service, although in separate program offices. The presenters are in the Office of Coast Survey, and I'm, as you said, at the National Geodetic Survey. But it all started as one thing in 1807 when President Thomas Jefferson established the Survey of the Coast. Since that time, there have been name changes and reorganizations, but we still share the distinction of having our origin as the oldest scientific agency in the federal government. And despite the changes that have occurred since 1807, that original mission continues to this day. With that bit of background, allow me to introduce our two speakers. Today's webinar is being presented by Meredith Westington, a geographer with NOAA's Integrated Ocean and Coastal Mapping Program, and Commander Bree Welton-Hillstrom, Chief of NOAA's Ocean and Coast Survey Hydrographic Survey Division. Meredith is the lead for Seascape Alaska, a regional mapping campaign, and she's author of the U.S. Bathymetry Gap Analysis, which tracks the general progress of mapping in U.S. waters. She has worked at NOAA's Office of Survey Coast since 1999. Meredith has a bachelor's degree in geology from Virginia Tech and a Master's of Science degree in GIS management from Salisbury University. Commander Hillstrom has been a NOAA Commissioned Corps officer for over 18 years, with close to 10 of those years in sea assignments aboard NOAA's hydrographic ships, mapping on both coasts of the United States, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Arctic. Those assignments include commanding the NOAA ship Ferdinand R. Hassler and Thomas Jefferson. While on land, she has served in billets throughout the Office of Coast Survey. Bree has a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Smith College and a master's of science in ocean engineering ocean mapping from the University of New Hampshire, which is an international hydrographic organization category A certified program. We are all honored and delighted to have these two distinguished speakers here today. Now, after the presentation, we will take questions. To ask those questions, just click on that Q&A box in the lower horizontal navigation bar, and you can type the question in there. And then I will work through those and read them to ask the speakers to respond. With that, thank you all for being here today. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Meredith and Bree.
Thank you, Michael. And yes, welcome everyone to a presentation about the goals, progress, and challenges associated with the National Strategy for Ocean Mapping, Exploring, and Characterizing the United States EEZ and the Global Seabed 2030 Initiative. Again, I'm Meredith, and I am with NOAA's Integrated Ocean and Coastal Mapping Program within the Office of Coast Survey. And our motto, if you haven't heard it, is map once, use many times, and this will probably come up a few times in this presentation. In this webinar, my colleague, Commander Brianna Hillstrom, and I are going to introduce the U.S. International Mapping Goals, strategies for reaching those goals, our current state of progress, and some challenges to overcome. So to set the stage, I'd like to talk about the International Seabed 2030 Initiative. It debuted in 2017. And for those that are new to this initiative, I'm just gonna play a video, which is a pretty jazzy synthesis of why we're talking about seafloor mapping. And at this point, I think Rick is gonna play the video.
You are here. You have the whole world in the palm of your hand. Or do you? Think of our world as a giant puzzle. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet. And the dark reality is, we are missing most of the pieces. Just imagine what we will discover. The technology we will develop. The lives that will be impacted. If we come together to solve the ultimate puzzle, a complete map of the world by 2030. The Nippon Foundation and GEBCO are charting a course. Join us. We all have a part to play. No one project, no one organization, no one nation can do it alone. United, we can change the world piece by piece.
Okay, and now I'm switching back to my screen. Okay, thank you. Just to put a little bit more context on it, the Seabed 2030 goal, as was already stated, is to produce by 2030 a freely accessible map of the world's seafloor from a synthesis of direct seafloor measurements. Initially, the goal was 100-meter resolution, but over time, that goal has shifted to about 400-meter resolution on average. With the recent release of GEBCO 2022, it's estimated that 23.4% of the global seafloor is mapped. These areas are shown in red and gray on this map, and the remaining areas are composed of estimated seafloor topography derived from models. For some perspective, a year earlier, about 20% of the GEBCO map was composed of direct seafloor measurements, and back in 2018, it was 6%. So that was at the beginning of the Seabed 2030 project. Again, the goal is 100% by 2030. There is momentum. So last year, the Nippon Foundation GEBCO Seabed 2030 project became one of the first actions officially endorsed as part of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And just a few weeks ago at the United Nations Ocean Conference, NOAA formalized its commitment to mapping the ocean bottom through a signed Memorandum of Understanding with the Seabed 2030 project. Let's see, okay. So for some context on the US support for Seabed 2030, in 2020, the US debuted the National Strategy for Mapping, Exploring, and Characterizing the United States Exclusive Economic Zone, or NOMEC strategy. There are many similarities between Seabed 2030 and the NOMEC goals because the latter was clearly inspired by the former, but NOMEC goes several steps farther and seeks to not only map, but explore and characterize priority areas of US waters to advance our understanding of the marine environment. Recognizing a significant difference in level of effort to complete mapping in nearshore waters versus deep waters, NOMEC applies the 2030 goal to waters deeper than 40 meters, and for waters shallower than 40 meters, the NOMEC goal is 2040. So there are 5 goals in the NOMEC strategy. The first deals primarily with coordinating the federal government. The second and third deals with approaches to mapping, exploring, and characterizing the US EEZ. The fourth is focused on advancing science and technology, and the fifth emphasizes public and private partnerships. All of these goals are needed in order to accomplish the larger NOMEC vision, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on goal 2, which is map the US EEZ. So you might ask, what is ocean mapping? And within the NOMEC strategy, it says that ocean mapping provides comprehensive data and information needed to understand seafloor characteristics such as depth, topography, bottom type, sediment composition and distribution, and underlying geologic structure. What precisely is needed to accomplish this task is explored in something called the Standard Ocean Mapping Protocol, which I'm going to cover on the next slide, and it is also referenced in NOMEC. So a Standard Ocean Mapping Protocol is something that's called for under Goal 2, Objective 2.1 of the NOMEC strategy. The protocol is currently under development by the Interagency Working Group on Ocean and Coastal Mapping. That's a federal interagency working group. But public feedback was sought during a symposium last October. At its highest level, the protocol will include specifications for different data types, currently bathymetry, seabed backscatter acoustic imagery, water column data, side scan sonar imagery, sub-bottom profiler, and magnetometer data. Plus, there's an emphasis on data management to ensure that all data collected are publicly accessible to reduce duplication when we start planning to fill gaps. While the bathymetry is the primary data type for the broadest set of applications, the standard ocean mapping protocol is intended to be a guide of best practices and standards to use when we go about mapping to make the most of every survey mile. Under Goal 2, Objective 2.2, there's a call to coordinate and execute campaigns to map the US EEZ. Their purpose is to promote efficient, effective, and comprehensive mapping of the US EEZ. So in support of this objective, there are several regional campaigns happening now. To be fair, many of these predate the NOMEC strategy, but have adopted the goals of NOMEC in order to anchor the importance of their work. These include the Florida Coastal Mapping Program. There's a group called Express on the West Coast, Aspire in the Atlantic Ocean, and Lakebed 2030 covering the Great Lakes. And just last year, Seascape Alaska formed to support not only NOMEC, but there's also an Alaska Coastal Mapping Strategy, which is a separate mandate focused specifically on Alaska. It came out exactly the same time as NOMEC. So at the heart of our mapping efforts is a basic question about what it means for something to be mapped. And the short answer is that it really depends on who you ask. We can all agree, however, that we do have basic problems with respect to our knowledge of the seafloor, even the most fundamental knowledge of our seafloor. And where there's a lack of basic bathymetry, there's likely also a lack of knowledge about the other data types that I just mentioned in the standard ocean mapping protocol. So for the sake of understanding even our basic US scope of work per NOMEC, we established minimal standards for mapped based on these criteria shown on the left. These criteria were established in 2017 in response to the debut of the Seabed 2030 initiative. So again, they predate NOMEC, but it's carried through. And our basic definition for minimally mapped is that the area, first of all, must be surveyed using modern equipment, which for us is between 1960 and the present. Second, each 100-meter cell of this analysis must be supported by at least one sounding, which is pretty generous in the eyes of a lot of people. And the bathymetry used in the analysis must be publicly accessible at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information or the Office for Coastal Management. The bathymetry layers, including in this sounding density analysis, are shown on the right side of the slide. We are including data from the Multibeam, Single Beam, NOS Hydrography, and crowdsourced bathymetry pipelines at the National Centers for Environmental Information, as well as the extended continental shelf grids that the US has. Those consist of multi-beam surveys that have undergone a thorough analysis, quality check, and support of the law of the sea documentation needs for extending one's continental shelf. And then also included are bathymetric LiDAR surveys. Those are accessible from NOAA's Digital Coast, which is hosted by the Office for Coastal Management. It's worthwhile to note that this definition of mapped does not adhere to the definition of mapped for many applications, and I want to be, careful about that. For example, it doesn't fully align with the definition of mapped for safe navigation, habitat mapping, or hazards assessments, to name a few. But what it does do is give us a very broad understanding of where we have something versus nothing. And our goal is to fill these basic knowledge gaps by 2030 or 2040 in the case of shallow waters. So the analysis results in this web service called the US Bathymetry Gap Analysis. It is available on NOAA's Geo platform. And the web service is designed to be a visual backdrop showing where we have data binned in two classifications. The pink denotes cells with 1 to 2 soundings, and the purple denotes cells that are supported by 3 or more soundings. Starting in 2020, the analysis and the web service are now updated twice per year, in January and then again in July, which means that scripts are running now. So I realized, just to take a step back, that you might be looking at this map and thinking, but I can see seafloors, or seafloor features, that is, all over this map. How can parts be unmapped or unsurveyed? And I just want to reiterate, it's been mentioned before, but that the unmapped areas that we are talking about are largely comprised of coarse resolution estimated seafloor topography based on models, which could be a kilometer accuracy, maybe, or they could represent areas where we do in fact have high resolution mapping data that have been collected but are not shared for broader use. So it's a complicated narrative, I'll just say that. So accompanying the web service are area calculations and percentages of US waters that are mapped or unmapped. For the last 3 years, we've been publishing an annual progress report of unmapped US waters to help track our progress. The report highlights the geographic scope of our task to fill data gaps, and it is in fact the inverse of the web service information that I was just showing you on the previous slide. This map on the screen is featured on the front cover of our latest report. And as of January 2022, 52% of US waters remain unmapped. To reiterate, this analysis is based on data ingested to central repositories at the National Centers for Environmental Information or the Office for Coastal Management in the case of Bathy LiDAR. And it does not represent what was surveyed in 2021. Last year at this time, 53% of US waters remained unmapped. So also on the front cover of the report, we're tracking national progress as well as regional progress toward filling the gaps. The image to the right is pulled from the latest report. On the left, I'm noting that in the NOMEC implementation plan, we have a performance indicator associated with mapping to acquire a minimum of 150,000 square nautical miles of new bathymetric data coverage annually. This indicator, however large it may seem, is needed if we intend to reach our 2030 goal. So for a reality check, we have our actuals on the bottom left. And this is what we've been tracking since the Bathy gap analysis began. So we have like 4 years now of data to sort of look at. And my sort of simplistic message on this is that we really should be thinking about doing 3 times more than what we currently do in order to reach our goals. And it's a very simplistic, as I think Bree will get to later. So directly related to that performance indicator of 150,000 square nautical miles of new bathymetry annually, there's a call in the NOMEC strategy to make data usable and available under that Goal 2, Objective 2.3. Again, our broad scale tracking of this mapping metric is based on how the data make their way through the data pipeline, so from ping to archive. This is critical because for most of our efforts, it really only counts if the data that are collected are usable and accessible. So I think it should be clear that we have quite a lot to do in order to reach our NOMEC goals. And this is with respect to just the most basic of mapping. And I'm not even diving into the other facets of NOMEC, which involve the collection of other data types, such as those listed in the Standard Ocean Mapping Protocol, as well as ones related to exploration and characterization. So in these next few slides, I want to talk about some basic strategies to fill these gaps, which are also mentioned as an aside on that back page of the progress report that I'm talking about, the annual progress report on unmapped US waters. So the first strategy really speaks to the need to make all bathymetry publicly accessible. I will probably say this 5 times over before I'm done, and then Bree might even say the same. So NOAA, specifically NCEI, it is a widely recognized national and international repository of bathymetry. And the bathymetry that it hosts comes from various sources, and external stakeholders rely on that data to develop products and make decisions. So one of the things that, I've been doing this Bathy gap analysis for a few years now, and I've received various levels of feedback on that analysis. But one common critique that I get is someone will say that there is some missing data of which that individual has personal knowledge. And across government, industry, and academia, there are likely many bathymetric surveys that are known to only a few. So this is a little bit stepping into Commander Hillstrom's presentation, but within the Office of Coast Survey and her group specifically, there is a very small team of people. I call them small but mighty, and their sole job is to search for external data. External meaning external to the Office of Coast Survey, which of course collects data. But they do that in support of nautical charting, as well as to inform the need for hydrographic survey operations. They represent just one group, but I believe others do share their experience. And that is that hunting for external data is a time-consuming task, and efforts to make sure that any data collected goes directly to NOAA would benefit many, as well as count towards our NOMEC mapping goals. So one of the things we've tried in an attempt to track our engagement efforts with potential data providers and get things moving through the pipeline faster, last year we launched this web form, which we're calling the Data Provider Engagement Form. And the page is featured on NOAA's IOCM, Integrated Ocean and Coastal Mapping website. And it's a collaboration between my group, the External Source Data Group, and NCEI. And my ask, if anyone in this audience here has any data that they know has not been shared yet, and you'd like to share it with NCEI, we would love to know about it. And through this form, we just ask basic questions in order to really get to who's the right point of contact in order to follow up about next steps. But this is our data provider engagement form. So once we have a clear indication of the true data gaps, because we've exhausted the search for pre-existing data, we do actually need to acquire data, which is another strategy to reach our goals. The progress report speaks at a really high level on this subject as well, and this is a screen capture from that back page of the report. There are different acquisition strategies that are needed at different depths. In the nearshore, airborne bathymetric LiDAR collection is most desirable if conditions allow. Uncrewed aerial vehicles, surface vehicles are just a few tech innovations that serve as force multipliers to increase data coverage. And then the crowdsourced bathymetry pipeline is a pretty new and exciting development at NCEI, and it's specifically called out in this report because it enables non-traditional survey vessels to help fill data gaps where mapping resources are scarce. So to further hone our acquisition strategy, we really do need to coordinate to make the most of every survey mile and support the map once, use many times mantra. Coordinated mapping in support of NOMEC requires that the data move through different stages of a life cycle in a timely manner. The mapping coordination life cycle on this slide, it includes the following stages. Up at the top, we talk about planning and prioritizing new data needs. Then we move around and we collect and we verify the data. We process and produce products from that data. We then inventory and prepare that data for archive, and then we actually archive and publish that data, and then we pick it up again and we plan and prioritize new data needs. So to help with planning for success, at least within the academic research fleet, there is one outlet. It's the new UNOLS Marine Facilities Planning System, specifically the Research Planning Module. The UNOLS group, they graciously agreed to include the Bathy Gap Analysis web service as a layer that one can add to have better situational awareness about data gaps in order to help with survey planning. And then the other part is within the Integrated Ocean and Coastal Mapping Program, where I am, that we have this tool to help visualize planned mapping projects across non-academic sectors. We call this the U.S. Mapping Coordination Site. Some people call it C-Sketch. So this site is designed to host footprints of proposed, planned, and existing mapping data acquisitions. And while the site contains mostly federal plans, there are contributions from interests beyond the federal government with room to expand. And the Bathy Gap analysis is also depicted on this site, as well as the most recent results of some spatial priority studies, which I'm going to talk about next. And between this site and the UNOLS site, this is just a small sample of some current and potential coordination platforms that we do need in order to reach our NOMEC mapping goals. So to further assist with coordination, we within the IOCM group have also conducted a series of spatial priority studies. So far, we've concluded one for NOAA. I believe it was 2020 that was done. And then right after that was non-NOAA federal mapping partners participated. And then we extended out into the regions. We've completed a Great Lakes study as well as an Alaska study. The spatial priority studies are a type of participatory GIS where respondents are asked to prioritize specific areas of interest. The results of all 4 of these studies are available on the US Mapping Coordination site, and there is additional information on our IOCM site in the form of tech memos and recorded webinars. The screen capture that I have here on the slide is actually from the Alaska region. They've gone one step further. They have taken the spatial priorities results and they've incorporated them into a dashboard experience. The information in these studies will be used to find potential mapping partners, to discover what other data are of interest in shared areas, and probably most importantly, well, I don't know if it's most important, but it's also important, is to inform approaches to a multi-year mapping plan of action. So to wrap up, I'd just like to mention that achieving these NOMEC mapping goals is an interagency effort that is heavily dependent on partners for success. The federal agencies on this slide are members of the Interagency Working Group on Ocean and Coastal Mapping, and it leads many of the mapping related topics that I mentioned today. We each have something to contribute to advance these goals, and many of us partner with government, academic, and non-governmental organizations. Again, Goal 5 of NOMEC was public-private partnerships. So anyways, so for the remaining portion of this talk, I'm going to pass the mic over to Commander Hillstrom to talk more about the Hydrographic Surveys Division, their expertise, and their contributions towards the NOMEC goals and objectives. But I still get to drive. I just have to mute.
Thanks, Meredith. Yeah, I am ready. Thank you for driving. I appreciate it. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here with Meredith and Michael, joining today from NOAA's headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. So many of you, I think as most of your group knows, our primary mission has been the safety of navigation. And so we're keen participants in the NOMEC strategy. And I'm here today to talk about some of the things we're doing and the challenges encountered toward advancing those NOMEC goals that Meredith just described. We're the nation's nautical chart maker, and we're responsible for upgrading and maintaining those charts, surveying the seafloor and responding to maritime emergencies. So having a well-mapped and well-understood exclusive economic zone is critical to us and all of our chart and data users. Now, historically, we've adhered to the strictest of international standards. However, given the rise of ocean mapping and the size of our national exclusive economic zone, we've evolved to ensuring that the best available modern data is on our charts with the appropriate metadata on sounding confidence. So working with Meredith and the Integrated Ocean and Coastal Mapping team and our ocean mapping partners in the government, academia, research institutes, the private sector, we're constantly in search of the best available bathymetry. And so I think, as Meredith alluded to, that can mean finding it, which can sometimes mean extracting the bathymetry from data that was collected for other purposes, such as seafloor bottom detections from data that was collected for fisheries water column, something like that. It can also mean acquiring it, as she described, which means figuring out the right sensor, the right type of data necessary for any given area to efficiently meet the spirit of NOMEC's standard ocean mapping protocol ourselves. And it certainly means getting the data into a form where it can be used for charting and other purposes as well, meaning we know enough about it. We have the right metadata, that we know the datum or the reference unit it was collected in, the units of measurement, that we are able to reasonably estimate the uncertainty, and that we know enough about the sensor or the sonar that we can make intelligent decisions about what that data is able to resolve, what size of features it's able to detect, and the coverage that it acquires. Coverage we can assume it achieved. So next slide, please. But before I get into all of those undertakings, we wanted to share a video on ocean mapping from the Schmidt Ocean Institute, because it captures many of the physical ways ocean. Oh, getting a call on my Google phone. That's always great when you're real-time live. Anyhow, we love this video because it captures many of the physical ways ocean mapping is challenging, and it also portrays one of the many teams that are doing the noble work of contributing to Seabed 2030 and the NOMEC strategy at the Schmidt Ocean Institute. So take it away, Rick, please.
We know more about the surface of the moon than we know about what the surface of our planet looks like. We have a very good idea about our continents, but we do not have much of an idea about what the seabed looks like.
Now with the satellite altimetry, if you look on Google Earth or something like that, you'll see these undulations, you'll see little seamounts and things, but the resolution of that is absolutely horrendous when you think about what we could be getting.
There's still so much that is unknown, and it's very, very important to know the depth and the shape of the seabed, because it gives us some fundamental understanding, like sediment transport, ocean currents, fisheries, knowing where we can lay a pipeline or a cable. It gives us some information about tsunami forecast and many, many more.
Multibeam sonar has definitely come a long way. Its initial stage was actually a lead line, where people just dropped a line off the ship and measured it that way.
In order to see a high-resolution view of the seafloor, we send down these sound waves. And you have a moment when you know that you sent the sound, it hits the bottom and then comes back up, and that time that it took the sound to travel is how we know how deep that is.
The EM302 and 710 that are on Falkor, instead of one beam below the ship, we have 432 beams that allow us to get a much, much larger swath of the seafloor.
Falkor is in some way very special because the ship in itself has been made for speed. Normally this would create little air bubbles that go along the hull. These would disturb the signals. So to mitigate this, the engineers put a platform underneath the hull. And that platform has got all the acoustic instruments on it. But it has the advantage that all the air bubbles get pushed away and they do not have any effect on the acoustic instruments there. So the data quality that we get back, especially at high speeds, is absolutely fantastic.
And the best part about our system is that our GPS that gives us our positioning reference can give us up to 8 centimeters accuracy. So when you're pitching and you're rolling and you're turning around and you're heaving up and down on waves, when the sound beam goes out and then the ship rolls and then it comes back, you're able to calculate where that beam actually struck the seafloor. We're able to render 3D surfaces that we can then interact with. We can spin them around, we can look at them from different angles, which is very helpful at times to identify an area that we'd like to go to and investigate. So there is a GEBCO 2030 seafloor mapping initiative where they intend to have the entire seafloor of the Earth mapped to a reasonable resolution by 2030.
It's an absolute fantastic project. It's a collaborative effort to create a definitive map of the ocean floor.
Schmidt Ocean Institute and RV Falkor are committed to providing all the mapping data that we collect so that anyone in the oceanographic community can make use of it. And I'm excited to be a part of this because in order to reach the goals of mapping the entire ocean by 2030, I think it really will take every bit of effort and anyone who has the capability to share that information.
Thanks a bunch, Rick. Yeah, so back to the slide. So, as you can see, to map, explore, and characterize, you're trying to capture the shape of an unknown and potentially dynamic seafloor surface through a dynamic ocean water column with currents and sea life and chemical makeup from a vessel riding on a dynamic sea surface. This is done by recording where you are on Earth through GPS, recording your vessel kinematics through motion sensors, and recording how far away the seafloor is from the vessel through a multi-beam sonar or some other remote sensing technology, as well as trying to best model and correct for the properties of the ocean that may be influencing the sensor, such as sound speed or bubbles or things in the water column. And then you're putting all that information together and reducing it to a common reference frame. And so many of these challenges parallel what's going on with other sources of bathymetry, such as LiDAR, satellite drive bathymetry as well. So it's a lot of things to put together to make these beautiful maps of the seafloor. However, technology and innovation continues to answer the call in remote sensing with light, sound, photo imaging, as well as all the auxiliary sensors used to put all this together to correctly position and correct the data. And in the areas of computing and signal processing and data storage, to the point of being relatively seamless, so much more than it was 10, 20 years ago. However, not all of the existing platforms are fully capable of mapping all areas of the ocean to these modern standards that Meredith described with the standard ocean mapping protocol. And sometimes there's frankly competing scientific interests that can sometimes come into play when optimizing for one type of data acquisition over another. Next slide, please. So let's think about what's out there in the US. Here in the NOAA fleet, in addition to the 4 hydrographic ships that have been dedicated historically to the nearshore mapping for nautical charting, 9 of the ships are now outfitted with some sort of multi-beam, either shallow water, midwater, deep water, various frequencies, meaning they can map to different depths. And all but a few have some sort of advanced acoustic system on them that can be used to collect or derive some form of information about the seafloor. So there's stuff there, and it's ever expanding. Next slide. Plus, there's the 12. Oh, go back one, Meredith. I wanted to highlight the 12 vessels in the academic research fleet that carry multi-beams. Not all fully shallow to deep, but they have the multi-beam capability on board, as well as the other federal vessels that we just highlighted, such as the research vessel Falkor, operated by the Schmidt Ocean Institute, and research vessel Nautilus of the Ocean Exploration Trust. Next slide. And we can't forget about the aerial mapping capabilities either, and not to mention the vessels, aircraft, platforms, drones, autonomous vehicles that exist in the private sector. Next slide. But even to get close to the 2030 goal that Meredith was talking about, we, in the last year, we've only made 1% advanced, and we're 8 years away from 2030. Doing 1% a year is not even close. That won't even get us there. So we need to continue to expand by orders of magnitude to use the existing ocean mapping capacity of the US as intelligently and efficiently as possible, and to be honing our use of autonomous systems as force multipliers in data acquisition. Next slide, please. So coming online in 2024 and 2025 are 2 new NOAA ships referred to as the AGOR variants, Oceanographer and Discoverer, each with a full suite of sonars that can cover the shallowest to the deepest ocean waters, and which should be able to help map the gaps anywhere they deploy. Next slide. And after them, the anticipated replacements for 2 of NOAA's oldest hydrographic ships, Rainier and Fairweather, with an estimated delivery time sometime around 2026, will be focused on deploying and recovering a variety of small craft, from crewed platforms to uncrewed platforms, depending on the technology. So they can flex and take advantage of the technologies that develop over the next several years. Each will individually be equipped with a full suite of the mapping sonars, but also have the ability to launch and recover at least 4 large dedicated platforms to flex, as I mentioned. Next slide. And as many of you are aware, many of the contributions to NOMEC and Seabed 2030 are being done in the private sector. Coast Survey's primary mechanism for partnering with the private sector on seafloor surveys is through our Hydrographic Survey Services contract vehicle. The current contract services vehicle was awarded in December 2019 to 7 prime contractors, many of which you are partners or members. Ocean Surveys Incorporated, eTrack, Geodynamics, Leidos, Fugro, David Evans and Associates, and Terrasond. This contract vehicle is a 5-year, $250 million indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract awarded under FAR 36 that is specific to architectural and engineering services and allows for a qualifications-based selection process. Again, getting the right people, the right platforms, the right equipment at the right time. This fiscal year, in 2022, we are awarding $28 million in contracts with 2 projects in Alaska, 1 in the Great Lakes, 1 in the Gulf of Mexico, and 2 along the East Coast. So expanding the use of this contract and of the mapping capable ships within our entire nation is key to the NOMEC strategy. And additionally, reducing mobilization and demobilization efforts and costs is part of intelligently using our national mapping capacity, which is why we are moving to option years on this existing hydrographic services contract, pending funding available, of course, always, but getting a team to a place and keeping them up and running and mapping helps us continue to take full advantage of the mapping capacity in the US. And so after the end of 2022, Coast Survey has the capacity to execute up to the full ceiling of that current contract should appropriations and or funding through partnerships become available. And so we anticipate at least having a $150 million contract ceiling remaining at the end of this year. Next slide. So in terms of data acquisition, the challenge really does come down to physics, both the physics of the ocean and the physics of putting all the pieces together in the right place and the right time, regardless of where they come from. Meaning, how do we get all the sensors, the multibeams, the LiDARs that are out there on all the platforms that are out there, the ships, the boats, the aircraft, the autonomous vehicles in the sky and on the surface or under the water, with the people and IT infrastructure to make sure we're using our collective national ocean mapping capacity to the fullest extent possible. Next slide. But intelligently and efficiently collecting the data isn't enough either. We have to evolve to be able to handle the influx of this data that is magnitudes of order, magnitude greater than what we're used to or accustomed to dealing with. And so things like standardized metadata and data licensing is one way that allows us to tag data with machine readable attributes to automate as much of the pipeline as possible. Next slide. Our National Bathymetric source team applies the standard metadata and the licensing information, basically the information about the data about the data, that allows us to intelligently combine all of the sources together. Next slide. So we can easily put all the information together for as many uses as possible. So on the left of this slide is like the combined surface, and on the right is all the different pieces of data, some of which overlap. There might be multiple sources of data in any given area, and so it's about intelligently putting it together to make one seamless bathymetric model that is usable, meaning that we know the data and we know the units, we know the uncertainty, and we know what it can be used for in terms of resolving features on the seafloor. Next slide. And that allows us to support things like habitat mapping. Next slide. And cable laying. Next slide. And to manage our coasts intelligently and wisely and detect change and to adapt for it. Next slide. And to identify our resources and steward them and to use them smartly to our advantage. Next slide. You go to slide 40. Oops. Yep. So that we can remain a resilient nation. Next slide. Oh. Okay, and then go to slide 42. Thanks a bunch. So the point here with all those different slides is there's a lot of ways to use this data, and it has a lot of applications, but it really needs to be able to be put together so that it is usable, which is all about goal 2 of the NOMEC strategy that Meredith was describing. So at a basic fundamental level, there are 3 steps to reach these NOMEC goals. It's critically important to share all the available data with centralized repositories. So as Meredith said, that's Digital Coast for bathy LiDAR and NCI for every other type of bathymetric data. The presence of data in those repositories enables others to do meaningful planning and prioritizing to fill the gaps. Participation from a wide spectrum of stakeholders is also needed to coordinate activities and pool resources for campaign mapping. Innovation is also critically needed to make the most of every survey mile, ensure the broadest use and accessibility for that data. So mapping once, using many times, sometimes we haven't fully extracted the full value of the data. Sometimes it's harnessed for whatever the primary use was, but then the leftovers might still be available for us to capitalize on. And then lastly, coordinated mapping to ensure the IOCM goal of map once, use many times going forward, and making sure that all of the resources are put together in an intelligent way so that we can move through ping to product and achieve a life cycle of continuous update and improvement over time. So the mantra, all hands on deck, is really required to reach NOMEC's ambitious mapping goals and timeline. So if you have any interest in participating, I invite you to reach out to us or join any of these regional mapping campaigns. So we thank you for however you've been involved so far or whatever you might have contributed to date, and ask that you join us in gathering, sharing, innovating, and using data. So I will end here and invite Meredith and Michael back on, and I guess we'll be open for questions for a bit of time. So thank you all for having us and being here today.
Well, thank you, Bree, and thank you, Meredith. That was a very good presentation. I'm thinking maybe I'm working for the wrong program office in the National Ocean Service. That was really good stuff. So right now, I really only have one sort of 3-part question in here. Maybe people will type things in as we're talking. Oh, good, things are starting to come in, so it's good. Ready? So the first is sort of a 3-part one. I'll kind of meld it all together into one from the same person. It's about using magnetometry data to map the seafloor, and the reason he's asking is being able to map by using the magnetic anomalies of the Earth to know where, say, an airborne UAV is located in GPS-denied environments. So the feeling is that magnetic maps are needed desperately to aid in that kind of mapping. He's wondering if that's being done, and if not, if you're aware of any other government agencies that are doing that sort of magnetic mapping.
So I don't know if Bree has do you have an answer to this too? Because I'll can muddle through with a half answer. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I think we both can. I mean, well, you go ahead, Meredith. I'll follow you.
Okay, maybe that's probably for the best. I'll muddle through. Yeah, so Brian, it's a great question. I don't know that I have the whole answer, and so I think what I would like to do is pursue this offline and see if I can get a better answer than what I'm about to say. But I think as a little bit of history, the Standard Ocean Mapping Protocol, when they were trying to identify what are the different mapping data needs that are out there, there were some obvious ones like backscatter, water column. These come up a lot in a lot of circles. And then for some of us, magnetometer data came out of left field. But so many people were like, this is so important. Like this, and gravity, I'm seeing that in there too. They're kind of interrelated. And so they are on, they are part of the Standard Ocean Mapping Protocol. And so, but in terms of the actual execution of like how we're doing that, that's the part I don't know. And I would need to do some follow-up to give you the good answer. But the short answer is, yes, it's on our radar. And then I'll let Bree have an even better answer possibly.
No, I think that was great, Meredith, because you're absolutely right. Those are always on the list, but it is, you know, as you can see, we're relying on the, you know, a collective action of an entire nation of a bunch of, you know, researchers and scientists that have a lot of different interests in the ocean. There's so much to know about the ocean, and so it sounds, I mean, I think we'll take all kinds, and if that's really the best that we have, we'll definitely take it. But it, you know, going back to can we do everything all at once? And there's certainly some trade-offs when you're at sea on a ship, and what types of data you can acquire and what interfere with one another. But yeah, having better magnetic data and gravity data is always on the list.
All right, so thanks, Meredith and Bree, on that. And that was from Brian Wyant, and he says he'll ping you via email to maybe get more information about it, just so that you have that. And I'll just continue through here. So so there's one from someone that joined a little bit late and asked if you mentioned gravity surveys, and actually I don't remember you guys mentioning gravity surveys in this. So is that part of what you do? Follow on.
We did not mention gravity surveys. It comes up periodically, but we did not mention it in this presentation. I don't know if Bree wants to add more.
I am always looking. I mean, and Michael, you might know, being with NGS, but with some of your colleagues, I'm always looking for extra money to add gravity measurements to some of the NOAA ships, particularly when they're operating near shore, because I understand that's one of the bigger gaps. You know, water side measurements near shore. I'm not an expert in that, but that's what I understand, and it's something that we're looking toward. And I think there's opportunities with the new ships coming online to define those needs and requirements. So, yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, that's the near shore is the toughest place for gravity on. You know, there's that place between the shore itself and where ships can go, and that's the really difficult part. So we would love to put gravimeters on your ships, I have to say. So, and speaking of that, because this other one is related, they're asking if you collaborate with this agency called the National Geodetic Survey. I know that one, for vertical datums and gravity products. Sorry if I didn't ask that well. Yeah, do you collaborate with us on that sort of stuff?
Yes, we do. I've met with your colleague Vicky Childers on so a lot of it comes down to money and funding and what we're tasked to do. And Meredith knows this well, with trying to get everyone at the table. We always want to do a lot of stuff, but we all have limited resources. So there are some opportunities, but in terms of a national program, again, there, you know, historically there have been national measurement programs within NOAA and also within I think NGA as well, and reinvigorating that need seems to be a topic that is more and more bubbling up, particularly, as you said, on the near shore mapping ships, where there's just a gap.
Yeah, and then we're working with NGA also. The gravity stuff is of interest, and Vicky Childers is my boss, actually. So yeah, so there you go. Let's see what else we have here. I was going to
add real quick, on the vertical datum piece of this puzzle. Certainly, yes. The short answer, are we collaborating with NGS, is yes. We're as you even had in your intro, we're like one big happy family, and there's a lot of touch points between our groups. But in terms of the NOMEC strategy, when I talked about Seascape Alaska and that regional mapping campaign, that one has overlap with the Alaska coastal mapping strategy, and that is one in which NGS is featured very prominently, both from its airborne topobathy LiDAR capabilities, and then also the VDatum gaps and the tidal datums, and so there's a lot of reference framework stuff that needs to happen in that region specifically, that has been called out specifically in that strategy, which is has strong ties to NOMEC as well. So there's ways that we sort of weave in and out. You need to have the good foundation. I think we all recognize that, good foundation.
Well, and that's great. I'm guessing you probably interface with Nick Kinsman quite a bit up there. Is that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Exactly.
That's
yep.
good. And along the similar lines, does the U.S. Navy share data with you? Another question.
That is a little bit more challenging. When it is unclassified, it has happened in the past, but it doesn't happen on a large regular scale. I mean, much easier if it's in our EEZ, but that's not always the places they're mapping. But yeah, we do work with them quite a bit, particularly with technology and survey procedures and data acquisition and processing and holding and management topics. We meet with them regularly, but in terms of actual data, not as much.
Okay, yeah. Interesting little side note that in the very early years, I think maybe the 1830s, the U.S. Navy took over the Coast Survey for a little while, but they gave it back to the civilians, so we have it now. Bree's holding something up. U.S. Coast Survey. Oh.
I'm holding up a great book. It's called The U.S. Coast Survey versus Naval Hydrographic Office. It gives a history of the U.S. hydrographic offices in the United States.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Another question. Is your 2030 goal just data collection, or does this include data grooming and integration of the multiple sources?
It does include synthesis of the data itself. And if you think about even the Seabed 2030 goal, right? If we go back to sort of how the NOMEC started or was inspired by Seabed 2030, they really are sort of centered on getting the data, wherever that data is, into the GEBCO map. So, and they're managing their progress by showing updates to the GEBCO map every year, and that's the blue marble. That's the bathymetry that we look at on every single one of the maps that we show. That base layer is the GEBCO map. And so on the national side, this is where there's a lot of different pieces to that puzzle in terms of integrating the data. But when Bree was talking about the National Bathy source, that is definitely one significant synthesis of that data for multiple uses within the US. I don't know if she wants to add more, but that, yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's right on.
Right, good, thank you. Yeah, and that's coming back to even crowdsourcing, which is something we do, though I kind of don't like the name. Sounds messy, but making sure the data is of high quality is an issue, right? That's part of making it work.
Or understanding the quality so that you can make the right decisions about its use. Because if you've got nothing, sometimes that's the best you have, and that's good for reconnaissance, or it's good for something, but maybe not the thing you want to do with it.
Right, and knowing what you have, right? That's for sure. Let's see, this one. What's NOAA's interest in obtaining higher resolution seabed maps beyond what multi-beam is currently capable of? For example, Ocean's Infinity and Fugro send sonars to the seabed to get really high resolution seabed maps. If that isn't currently a requirement, is there still interest?
I bet there's interest somewhere. I don't know, Meredith.
Is this a question about the resolution? Like, is the goal 400 meters, 100 meters, 1 meter?
Right, so that we have, you know, our partners at ocean exploration, or, you know, scientists that do deep water work, right? They sometimes often have requirements to get very high resolution data in very deep water that we at Coast Survey might not necessarily be concerned about for safety of navigation, but that there's a scientific interest or a need to understand at a much higher resolution. So I think they're sending vehicles with high resolution multi-beams on it that don't have the same range very close to the seafloor to get much better imagery. And so I guess my generic answer is I'm fairly certain that that exists, and I know of groups that are doing it, but not in a global scale for all parts of the ocean. It's been very directed at interesting scientific, seamounts or seeps or deep water corals or pipeline surveys, or throwing some stuff out there.
Yeah, really targeted applications. I suppose I guess the question is really if those data are available, are you interested in it? It sounds like you probably are. You're probably interested in anything you can get. That's what it sounds like.
That's like the creme de la creme.
Right.
The high resolution and very deep water. It's
yeah. Okay. And that should do on that one. And then I have this other one saying, thinking about the 1 sounding per 100 meter requirement, does satellite imagery derived shallow water bathymetry where there is no soundings have a role in the 2030/2040 goals?
Yeah, so the satellite derived bathymetry, which I think is what I think we're talking about here, satellite derived bathymetry. So there is not at NCEI a satellite derived bathymetry pipeline. There's a multi-beam data pipeline, there's a single beam, there's a crowdsourced bathymetry pipeline, and then there's the NOS, the hydrography pipeline. That's Bree's group. So on its face, satellite derived bathymetry, it requires somebody, at least where we are right now, as I understand, it requires somebody to actually look at that data to then derive like an uncertainty value. And, is it useful for whatever the use case is? And so again, there's multiple use cases, right? We could be habitat mapping, we could be safe navigation stuff, which is where Bree sits. And so the way that the satellite derived bathymetry makes its way into this whole Seabed 2030 NOMEC, the mapping progress is pretty much through, at this point, things could change, but I'm just saying the current lay of the land is that it would go through the NOS hydro pipeline. So to the extent that the hydrography side and that use application for safe navigation is looking at that data and has said, yes, we are using that data. It is, it meets our standards because they have standards. And then that data gets packaged and then archived and shared at NCEI. That's sort of how it gets tracked in terms of our progress. This is, I think, a very dynamic space, how satellite derived bathymetry gets used. So I could imagine in the coming years that this might change, but that's where we are right at this moment. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and in the sort of institutional efforts are being led by the remote sensing division at the National Geodetic Survey, and with Mike S. Laskin's group, and we are working with them about how to qualify it and test it. So we've got cross lines planned in areas where they've provided it, and we often use it for planning and reconnaissance as well. So we're also discussing adding it to the National Bathymetric source as a data stream as well in the near future.
It kind of sounds like one of the big questions is the uncertainty of the data. So, and that's what's being evaluated now.
Yeah, and what a type of feature it can resolve, and what the extinction depth, and the depth that it can go to in different areas under different physical properties of the area.
There are no more questions in here, but I might ask one. I'm allowed to do that, aren't I? Hey, I'm a geodesist, so I'm naturally going to gravitate, no pun intended, to a particular thing, and that's combining all these data sorts from all over the planet. What reference frame do you use to georeference everything consistently? does that vary, or how do you deal with it?
Yeah, maybe Meredith can talk to Seabed, and then I can talk to the National Bathymetric source. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not one of the people that's compiling that GEBCO grid. So I've certainly not walked the walk. There are, I want to say, 4 or 5 regional data centers that are doing that compilation. My understanding is, I think if you looked at the metadata for the GEBCO grid, I think it probably says that it's WGS 84. I would be surprised if it's anything more specific than that. I imagine there's a magic wand. And then I have, there are some real issues with knowing what the data is that went into GEBCO. Sometimes it's, we get down to the raw and process soundings. Sometimes it's grids that somebody else has already created and may or may not come with, a specific. So I think there's a distinction to be made between the GEBCO grid, which I think has tremendous value on a global scale. And then what I think Bree wants to talk about, which is the US-centric thing, which is very much, I like to talk about as sort of feeding this vision of a 4D navigation surface, where you really are trying to track much finer details. And so, yeah, I'll just let Bree talk about how they're tracking that, if that's where you wanted to go.
I was going to keep it lighter. So if there's a link to the website, the Blue Topo website, and use data at on the screen that Meredith is showing right now, and that's the public product, and that's all in NavD88 because it's meant for civil engineering type stuff. It's not a navigation datum. The datum, when we portray it for navigation, will be in a navigation datum, like the mean lower low water, or it could be Mississippi River datum, or a lake datum, or the Hudson River datum, or some sort of datum that ties it to the navigation product. So that's all I was going to get into it. But there's a lot to unpack there, and NGS plays a big role in all of this, particularly with VDatum and filling the gaps in VDatum and providing the infrastructure to move your data wherever you want it to be. But it's really about knowing how it was acquired and keeping the right metadata so that we can convey it however we want.
Yeah, and that makes sense, especially for those coastal navigation type products. But on the global context, and the video, Bree, I think the video you showed, one of the people in there said getting 8-centimeter accurate positions anywhere on Earth with GNSS, and it just caught my attention. Then I was afraid someone would say something like WGS 84, and that makes me break out in hives a little bit. But we don't have to go into any depth on that, unless maybe we don't need to. I think that's probably just enough. WGS 84
probably open it up to this group, and we'll probably resolve. They could probably spend all afternoon and resolve all of that. Right. It makes me nervous being in this group and unpacking that.
Yeah, there is a lot there, and I know there's a lot of it's because of legacy, but it's as we move towards ever more accurate positioning, not just precise but accurate, resolving ambiguity in what WGS 84 means is important. So we'll have to deal with it at some point. And NGS, we're working with NGA on that to some degree. So
yeah, and historically, as we move into precision navigation, we used to talk about meters of uncertainty, and that was fine. We were totally okay with that. And now we're talking about sub-metric or centimeter level. We're getting close and operating on the margins and making the most of our coast. It's a really exciting times. So
yeah, and that's you nailed it. That's the key. When you go from a few meters down to sub-meter, that's where all the complications really manifest themselves. That's where the real and people have this long history of doing things a certain way because it didn't matter before. You could say WGS 84 and NAD 83 were the same, that sort of thing. But
yeah,
there's 7 different WGS 84s, right? So anyway, we don't need to go into that. Well, I've blathered on a bit here, thinking someone might type another question in, but there are no other questions. I guess that sort of concludes this. I don't know if Rick wants to jump in and do a ceremonial sort of ending of the webinar, but certainly welcome to do so.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your participation. We've had great discussion and we appreciate the information. Just for our viewers, a note that we will have a recording of this posted to our website and YouTube channels within 24 hours. But again, we thank you all. Thank you, Commander Hillstrom and Meredith, and we appreciate Michael for your help moderating questions and introducing everything today. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.